I'm delighted to be here. I think this is an incredibly important issue at a time when a lot of people are saying, well, can people in Washington and state legislatures get together and do anything? The answer is, I believe, that we've already seen in the last several years, much has been done and can be done on criminal justice reform. A whole bunch more needs to be done in that zone. But in Washington, the next 2 years are largely gridlock, with the possible exception of this issue and a handful of small ball issues as well. And the reason is, look, everything in Washington, D.C. and most state capitals used to be bipartisan, because in Washington, the liberal Republicans, this 30, 40 years ago, would get together with the liberal Democrats, and they'd fight the conservative Republicans and the conservative Democrats. And the jerseys they wore didn't mean anything, so everything was bipartisan. Now, as a conservative who wanted the government to get smaller rather than larger, the nature of compromise was Richard Nixon wanted the government to get bigger, and Ted Kennedy wanted it to get much bigger, and so every year they'd compromise on somewhat bigger. And then the next year, they'd go somewhat bigger. And so between bigger and much bigger, they would compromise, and they were over at that side of the room after decades. What I'm talking about now is not the bipartisanship opportunity of the mushy middle, people who don't particularly have principles or care about very much, but just want to make it look good, but rather left-right coalitions. And this is what's happening in a lot of states and at the national level. And by that I mean principled conservatives and principled men and women of the left who are not sacrificing their principles to get something done, but both are end up trying to do the same thing. And one of the opportunities we have is on criminal justice reform. Why conservatives? Why now? Well, now, part of the reason when we talk about operating on a budget, one of the reasons is that the costs of our present strategy of mass incarceration, incarcerating people for long periods of time, mandatory minimums, little flexibility on the part of judges, has gotten expensive. And we've gotten the attention of state legislators and even folks at the federal level when they realize how expensive it's been, and then they're willing to be open to new ideas. You saw this, the sequester, the federal sequester puts a limit on total government spending, and all of a sudden there's a lot of interest in reforming the defense budget, okay? We should have been reforming the defense budget for quite some time, but only when there's a cap on are people talking about it. We're hitting some caps at the state level. So number one, it's getting more expensive, and number two, there's a good example. And that is the Texas effort, Texas Public Policy Foundation, some of the efforts in Hawaii. There are some examples that have worked. And by working, I mean that we've actually saved money in the case of Texas. A number of prisons have not had to be built. They've saved about $2 billion there as they've moved from putting people in prison to higher touch parole and probation, drug courts. Money's been saved, prisons haven't had to be built and manned, and other states are looking over. Now, the reason why right on crime is an effective tool and left on crime has not been in the newspapers recently is that the conservatives, one, helped to create part of the problem. And I certainly, as somebody who was active politically going back many years, I just assumed that the wardens and the prosecutors were taking care of this, okay? And that I would focus on, and many conservatives, we would focus on things the government ought not to be doing at all and try and get them to stop it, or at least do the things they shouldn't be doing less destructively or just less of it, okay? And not as much focus on those things the government needed to be doing and how they were run. We trusted the experts, mistake number one. We trusted the people who had an actual interest in how these things were run, a self-interest in how they were managed. And we measured inputs instead of outputs. Everything that self-respecting conservatives laugh at when our friends on the left do it, oh, I care a lot about education. I've spent $2 gazillion. Can the kids read? No, 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 you didn't hear me. I care deeply. I spent a lot of money. And yet some people would say, you know, hey, we're fighting crime. We put 100,000 people in prison. Who? What were they doing? What would they have been doing? Was there another way to, hey, did you hear me? We put 100,000 people in prison. This morning I was reading a 1992 study by the U.S. Justice Department explaining if we only put several 100,000 more people in prison, we'd have this whole thing licked, 92. And the goal was putting more people in prison. That was the metric, and if you get what you measure, hey, we filled the prisons. We built more prisons. And people, if you remember, campaigned. I built more prisons. I put more people in prisons. I hired more cops. And we were measuring inputs rather than outputs. So a couple of things happened. We did that for several dozen years, and it didn't work. It cost a great deal of money. And a number of other things that distracted conservatives, like the Soviet Union, largely went away and ceased to absorb quite as much of our time. So thanks to the Texas Public Policy Foundation, a number of the state think tanks, there's a lot more interest, and Right on Crime has brought this together, where conservatives are saying, one, we really want to punish crime. Okay, and the fact that it's Texas, I've worked with the Right on Crime people and testified in a number of states, and when you're testifying and you've got the legislators up there and you say, now here's something they did in Texas, all of a sudden people put the pencils down and they're looking at you. Texas? You mean I'm not going to get attacked for being soft on crime if I do this? Yes, not only is it done in Texas, so your right flank is covered, because this is something that was done in Texas, but they did it 5 years ago in Texas. 5 years, you mean like 2 election cycles ago? So this is safe, okay? Politicians like to know, it's nice to know if it works, but most important, is this the kind of thing that gets me unelected? Okay, in which case I really need to work on something else. And the fact that we now have had several election cycles with candidates successfully working on questions of dealing with moving away from mass incarceration, moving away from mandatory minimums, and winning the next election, and seeing crime go down. Each of those is key, and that's why the right has to come and play the role that it has begun to play, which is to be there and be very serious and say, we're very serious about crime. In Texas, when they're not reforming the criminal justice system, they're executing murderers, okay? So it's not as if that this is some sort of mushy middle, we went this far, now we're going to come back 10% because that's the reasonable thing to do. It's the mushy middle position. That's not the argument. The argument is we want to reduce crime as rapidly and as seriously as possible while spending less money, but the real cost in doing this wrong are broken families, destroyed neighborhoods, and lives that didn't need to be stunted. So the dollar amount is important. It's not unimportant. It gets everyone's attention, gets the politicians' attention. Everybody else who'd like to spend the money looks at potential savings and wants to help you on the project. But this is not just about, it's not even mainly about dollars and cents. We've been doing things poorly. We haven't been doing them as well as we could. It could be called smart on crime as well as right on crime, but right on crime helps when you're trying to convince elected officials, Democrats and Republicans, that they're covered on the flank that says, I don't want to be accused of being weak on crime, soft on crime. I testified, remember that long debate we had in Washington, D.C., they made the penalty for crack cocaine 100 times greater per weight versus white powder cocaine. And after 15, 18 years, we finally got it voted to be 18 to 1 instead of 100 to 1. I'm not quite 100% sure of where 18 came from, what was wrong with one-on-one, but a Republican senator had a brain fart, and he decided 18 was it, and we said, we'll take it. We will take it, 18 to 1. But I testified on the mandatory minimum question, and again, when you're able to talk about Texas, when you're able to give serious center-right conservative political leaders and activists in support of this effort, and there was this fight between the Republicans and the Democrats up on the committee because the Black Caucus had been instrumental in passing the original high numbers, but then there'd be the attack on the Republicans that this was a racist thing to have 100 to 1, And there was this compromise. If you stop telling everybody who thought about this and invented it, we'll stop calling you racist. And there was this détente, and everybody agreed not to hyper-politicize it, which it had been all the way through. And at the end of the day, to pass it, to reduce the penalties to crack cocaine. You imagine the 30-second ads. Like, Fred voted to make crack cocaine more available to your children, okay? Okay. We not only had to get a majority of the House because of the way they did, it had to be done by unanimous consent. Any one person could have stood up on the floor and said, I say no, and they would have been on Fox TV that night, being Mr. Hardcore on crime, okay? And everybody, and all of the work would have not happened. So we really had to take this out of the contentious political zone. And that's one of the opportunities that Right on Crime presents, and working with the ACLU. One of the more recent talks I've done on the question of right on crime and what is available to do was at ALEC, recently demonized as the conservative state legislature fight, funded by the ACLU, okay, to put it together, and I gave the talk. So there is, again, this is not the mushy middle sort of coming to some sort of agreement and pushing activists right and left out. What you actually have is something which is the only real bipartisan stuff that's moving these days, where you have right-left coalitions, transparency at the federal and state level. Very conservative guys and very liberal guys want full transparency of how money's spent. The guys in the mushy middle and the traditionalists and the establishment who've been spending all the money, they don't necessarily want everybody looking at this and having everything online. But serious principled right-of-center activists and serious principled left-of-center activists. I tease Ralph Nader, who is a big advocate of both criminal justice reform and transparency, that he's under the impression that if everybody saw how the federal government spent their money, they'd go, hey, Mom, look at how they're spending our money. Let's send more, okay? I don't think that's going to be people's reaction. I think they might be with me and going, look at how they're spending our money, let's spend less. But the principle is the same. We both think the American people should see how and where their money's being spent, and you have a right-left agreement on transparency. You also have a right-left agreement on reducing some of the mandatory minimums, on reducing mass incarceration. How long do you have to keep someone in prison? If our goal is to reduce the amount of crime, what are the opportunities to do it in more high-touch probation and parole and less putting people in prison? Sure, the numbers are there and they're stark. You know, California, $50,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. In Florida, 20 to 25. I mean, something's very off there. Something's very wrong and needs to be fixed. But we have tremendous opportunities. And again, perhaps in addition to the right deciding to shift and focus on this, I'm not sure they've changed their mind. They just changed focus. We weren't paying attention on making this part of government work. We assumed the experts were taking care. We assumed if you measured inputs, that was what mattered. Both of those were not good bets, okay? And again, if you talk to a conservative, they're not ashamed of having not paid attention, but I wasn't focused on that, was doing other stuff. And you're right, nobody should ever measure inputs as a way to judge whether a project is working or not. And nobody should ever trust the experts and the people in charge forever, indefinitely. Shouldn't trust them this weekend, but not saying we trust you always moving forward. I would argue there's another thing, and part of it is the technology that's coming out, voice recognition, GPS, all of these other things. I mean, why does Uber work, right? Why are we having a conversation about taxis versus Uber? You know, why are we now having questions about putting people in boxes inside small walled cities as opposed to letting them stay outside but be identifiable by phone contact, personal contact, or GPS and other technology? Because technology allows it, because it's possible, because we can do this now, and it's a heck of a lot less expensive. So all of these efforts, again, Uber is attacked by all of the guys who've always been in charge. School choice is attacked by all the people who benefit from the government-run public school system, and the guys who run the prisons, and the guys who staff the prisons, and the guys who fill the prisons all have interests that are sometimes challenged by both technological changes and decisions that we're not going to put as many people in prison for as long as we've done in the past. We're having a discussion in other zones, and you can see this showing up now on tenure. Teacher tenure was considered something that was terribly important. Now people are going, it's part of the problem. I don't think we should have tenure for wardens and prison guards. I think we should have a lot more say-so over how long people stay in certain jobs, and a lot more management over the rules and the work rules and what takes place inside of prisons. The idea of leaving it to the guys who run it to make all the decisions and police themselves, and to watch the correctional officers' unions decide whether anybody misbehaved and whether there's a reasonable amount of rape going on, doesn't strike me as a reasonable way to handle this. So we've made a bunch of progress, and federalism helps too, okay? When you're doing something stupid at the federal level, it's a little hard to tell of the 100 things the federal government's doing, which was the stupid thing that caused the problem, okay? When you have 50 or 57 states, and one state starts to do something differently, and it works, it's a lot easier to get the other states to say, well, watch that for a couple years. Thank you, Texas. Thank you, some of the other states that have been early adapters, and then we'll move. And I think we're now where we have enough states that have made enough steps in the right direction that we can rapidly move towards getting all 50 states to move in this direction in a number of different zones as quickly as they're willing to. I've spent a bunch of time in Florida and talked to folks in Oklahoma and Arkansas and Alaska, and there's just this concern, does it really work? Am I going to get hit in the next election? And we saw this effort. The Democrat attacked the Republican running for governor in Nebraska for supporting right-on-crime initiatives and efforts, and the Republican won. He couldn't get flanked on the right on this issue, and I think that's an extremely helpful one. Again, watch for, and the reason why the right-left coalition instead of bipartisanship is the model is that people want to know that the issue's safe. And the way for Republican politicians to know that something's safe, and frankly a lot of Democrats as well, is to know that names and identified individuals and leaders of the right have staked out a position that it's okay to reduce the number of the length of mandatory minimums. It's okay to close a prison, and you won't get attacked by personalities and leaders political leaders on the right. And on the left, folks need to know, is this okay with the various structures of the modern left? And when you have both the ACLU and the American Conservative Union joining on an effort, people feel safe that they won't get attacked by one side or the other for moving forward. And then they can decide to judge it on its merits when they feel that it's safe politically, that you can, in fact, move forward on that effort. Again, the other pieces, there are a whole bunch of other pieces here where when we're trying to decide once you've decided the goal is to reduce crime instead of fill prisons, the goal is to get people who come out of prison to not go back, that what you're measuring is whether you reduce recidivism, what you're measuring is whether there are fewer murders, fewer rapes, fewer muggings, fewer housebreakings at the end of the process after your law than before your law, after the program rather than before it. Once you've decided how to measure it, what you're measuring, then people can come in with other ideas. Now, another idea that's going to be big in Texas, because Abbott just won, is thinking through licensing. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of jobs that you need a government license to do, like hair braiding in some states, and many of them probably shouldn't be licensed at all. And that's where we're having taxi cab drivers and Uber drivers and what needs to be licensed, dental assistants and so on. But the first thing they always stick into these rules is no felons. Okay, what would you rather have them robbing banks than cleaning people's teeth? I mean, and yet that's one of the things that when you're trying to, if you're trying to decide how to keep people out of prison, it's a different, instead of filling them at the beginning and then not paying attention as they roll out in their 40s, 50s, 60s, in the future, is to say, well, why do people come back? And start focusing on that. And it may not be viewed as criminal justice reform, but I think it ought to be. I mean, the first rungs of getting a job can be cut off for felons in completely unnecessary ways. I mean, I first ran into this in Bulgaria, where we were coming up with, after the communists got thrown out, and I was suggesting that if somebody wanted to be a taxi driver or run a hotel, they should just write a little letter to the government. Hi, I'm a taxi driver. Hi, I'm running a hotel, as opposed to have to go through the government licensing, which took months and months and months. And the response was, well, what if somebody was a bank robber? Okay, they could be a bank robber or they could be a taxi driver. Which do you want? And this idea that they're protecting us when they push people out of real jobs strikes me as not accurate. And not something that it doesn't work. The whole mandatory minimum fight, and this is happening at the federal level, the fights now are going to be mandatory minimums, trying to get some flexibility, some reduction on mandatory minimums. I testified on the mandatory minimum issue, and I had the list of things that are mandatory minimums, okay? Treason is 5 years. Dirty pictures is like 35 years. And as you looked at them, you said, this is based on how much television time you can get. These things are all crimes at the state level, except for treason. They're all crimes, and something about being mean to Indians on reservations. But they're all state crimes. They're not in any way federal issues at all. But somebody wanted to say, message, I care very, very deeply. And they just stuck in a mandatory minimum that they thought would go, ooh, he's really against that. I thought he might be for that. But now I see he's not only against it, he's really against it, because 45 years is a long time for selling dirty pictures. You know, I mean, you just looked at it and you said, this was in no way designed with criminal justice in mind. It was designed for a press conference. And unfortunately, it's a press conference that turned into a law. So how do we roll some of this back? I think step by step what Texas has done. I think other states looking at Texas and other states and saying, 3 states have now done this. They've done it for 4 years. No, you know, it's worked well. Crime continues to go down. Nobody lost an election. And we can start moving it horizontally. At the national level, we have 4,500 federal laws that can put you in jail, and something like 300,000 regulations that if you do it wrong, you can go to jail for. This is a big number. There's an effort at the national level, and it may be something that could happen even at the state level with too many crimes, which is a base closing commission concept, like what they've done 5-6 times, where they said, a commission will come up with military bases that the Pentagon doesn't want anymore. Here's 20 or 30, and unless Congress votes no, they get closed. So no congressman has his fingerprints on closing a particular base. They just didn't vote to override the Pentagon's decision, the commission's decision to not do it. There was an effort that the late Senator Specter was going to lead to set up a base closing commission for federal crimes. A lot of the federal crimes, you might look at it and say, yeah, that should be a crime. It just happens to be illegal in all 50 states already. Carjacking, you remember. When that got on the nightly news, somebody jumped up and said, let's make it a federal crime. I will be in the newspapers the next day for making it a federal crime. Whoever did that is now retired or dead, and the law is still there. Okay, how do you ever legalize carjacking and win the next election? Okay, so the idea of a base closing commission for federal laws, where we simply say we're going to get a bunch of judges and prosecutors and so on, so everybody's interests are protected, and look at 4,500 laws and decide, or there may be 200 or 300 that we could pass on. If all 50 states are already busy putting people in prison for these things, do we really need a federal law on them? And again, it took us 5-6 times on base closings to get many of the unnecessary bases closed. Not all of them, just many. It may take many bites at the apple for taking the same approach on over-federalization of crime. But I'd like to take some questions. I just want to point out, conservatives measured inputs. We should measure outputs. Conservatives trusted the experts and the people in charge, and you should always consult them, but not necessarily assume that everything they tell you is accurate or unself-interested or correct. And conservatives, again, focused not on the end game. They didn't measure what was important. Is crime going down, and are we having less recidivism, and are fewer lives disrupted? And by not just lives of victims, but lives of the relatives of people who do commit crimes and the criminals themselves. How do we make this less disruptive, getting people back on track with their lives and make it less destructive to their life as well as to the people around them, starting with the potential victims? Questions, thoughts? Who's going to be, got a microphone? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. This is Senator Westerfield from Kentucky. Thanks, by the way, for your help this past year on our juvenile reform.
I'm sorry. Should have
Thank you
mentioned
for that.
Kentucky. Great progress in Kentucky.
Appreciate that. As a conservative myself, and I think everybody in this room agrees that data-driven policies are best. We need to be able to show results for what we're doing, make sure we're doing what works. How do I go back and tell other conservatives that are, particularly as of late, very afraid of data being collected at any level by any government agency? How do I convince them that this is still a safe thing to do and the best way to guide our policy decisions going forward?
Well, a lot of data is public information. I mean, all crime, arrests, convictions, I mean, that's all really public information, and recidivism rates should be calculatable. So I don't think you have to go and ask for more information than is already publicly available. I'm not sure you have to get into violating privacy to make this work, and to the extent that you're looking at following criminals around, until they're out from under the system, they don't have the access to privacy. Yes. I'm sorry. The guy. Don't look at me. Look at the people with the mics, because I can't always see you with the lights in my eyes. Sorry.
Is it my turn? Okay. Hi, Mr. Norquist. My name is Mike Lawler. I work for Governor Dan Malloy in Connecticut, and I'm pretty sure you don't get a lot of questions from Democratic governors and blue states asking for your advice. But in this case, here's a dilemma we have, and I'd be very interested. It's kind of the same question you got asked a moment ago, but with a slightly different twist. In our state, both Democratic and Republican legislators are a little bit squeamish about some of the ideas we're talking about here. And when, on behalf of the governor, I go and speak to them, I'm wondering if you have any advice about magic words so that they'll believe it's not like a communist plot that I'm trying to sell to them. And the second part is, do you have a sort of a smart on crime conservative SWAT team that can show up in Connecticut and back me up when we try and advocate for these policies?
Well, first of all, Mark Levin's here with a lot of the Right on Crime staff guys, Texas Public Policy Foundation. Yes, I don't know that it, I know sometimes you guys send me out to various states, but there are a number of conservatives who've worked on this issue and can speak to its success in other states, state legislators who've moved legislation. The magic words Texas and Rick Perry are two magic words, and no one lost an election over the subject. In all seriousness, I would take people who were reticent and fly them to Texas and spend a couple of days in a Texas prison and talking to Texas prosecutors and have them walk through some of the things that they've done there, and a number of the states that have been early adapters. And there's look, I'm from Massachusetts prior to emigrating to the United States. And I'm fully aware that our friends on the left kicked away for some time the credibility on this subject. And people just, I mean, if there's a really good idea and it came out of Vermont, it wouldn't travel well. Because if this hadn't started in Texas, maybe it couldn't start anywhere other than Texas, but if it hadn't really gotten the kickstart from Texas, we'd have had to wait until Texas did it and then introduce it to other states. I have found in other states, that's, if you want a magic word, Texas, Rick Perry, because it makes the case, and again, no one lost an election on the subject. It's not like you have to go to the other side of the planet. visit Texas. Bring a bunch of guys down for a junket to visit the nice Texas prisons. And I think that would be very helpful. But again, the Right on Crime, Texas Policy Foundation, guys like myself would cheerfully come and work with people in Connecticut. There's a great center-right coalition. 45 states have center-right coalitions, as I run in Washington, D.C., where all of the conservatives get together, and we're trying to get the Right on Crime movement to have a representative in each of those meetings so that this is part of the center-right's issues that you work on. One of the things that you want people to be focused on is criminal justice reform from a principled perspective. But yeah, no, Connecticut, I think, could reach out to a couple of states that have succeeded and then show them. So it makes it clear that it's harder to be attacked. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Larry Matasar. I was on the commission in Oregon. I was a commissioner, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I practice in state and federal court and share your views on mandatory minimums. You know, we just want to talk. We just want to have a chance with the judge. But my question is, because I sat through many commission meetings in Oregon, many people, when they say it's crazy to give people, defendants 45 years for dirty pictures, what the response is, and I'd like to hear what the political right response is, well, don't you care about the children? There are children who are victimized, and every day X people are victimized, and you minimize all of this by just saying it's dirty pictures.
Okay. I didn't mean to be flip on that, sorry. Just, when I was looking, I know, but when I was looking at the list of things, murder wasn't up there, and treason was 5 years. So I think one of the advantages that conservatives have speaking to this is we tend to start with the victim and say, how do we deal with this now? And it's easier when a conservative says, I would cheerfully execute every murderer in the country. Okay, now, everyone who's not a murderer, now what do we do? Separate subject, okay? And there's some people that you wouldn't want to execute that you'd cheerfully leave in prison for the rest of their lives, okay? But that's not 2 million people, okay? That is a very small number of people. We can have an argument about whether to execute people or not. But a conservative who says, I'm very much interested in punishing crime, and I'm very much interested in protecting victims, both getting them compensation and or making sure there are fewer in the future, okay? Now, how do we get that? Take a guy in and then cycle him back out again so he can create more victims? That doesn't get us to the less victims. I think the more, when we talk about it, we just, from the heart, we need to be focused on victims not becoming victims and making them whole as much as possible. But that also means, how do you get guys who've made a mistake, done a bad thing, gone to jail, ended up on probation? How do we get them employed? Give them something else to do in their lives? Okay, how do we make it not difficult to do that? You can talk about running government programs to get people jobs. How about stopping the government programs like licensing that makes it difficult to get in? I'm all in favor, if you have a list of things to do, first the things the government does that are unhelpful, stop doing those, and then we can think about people's fantasies about government programs that work. But we know the ones that hurt. Stop those. But again, but it is very important. Focus on the victim. And we're not doing this to be nice to the criminal. We're doing this to have fewer victims.
Thanks, Grover. I was wondering, you mentioned...
Yes, hi.
You mentioned the...
Kevin Kane?
Good eye. You mentioned the sort of institutional support for the status quo that a lot of us have to push up against, and that's certainly...
A bipartisan status quo.
Absolutely, and that's an acute issue in a state like Louisiana, but I'm wondering what you think about the prospects for getting institutional support for reform from sort of traditional coalition center-right groups, particularly business groups, and really engaging them in this to be sort of a counterforce to that.
Well, I think once you've nailed down the ACLU and groups, left of center groups, and traditional right of center groups, so you have voices that tell guys on the left, this is a good idea, it's principled, and it's safe, and voices on the right saying the same thing. Now let's think about how to move forward. Then you can step in and talk to the business groups and the Chamber of Commerce people and say, what rules make it difficult for you to hire someone who was a felon, who you'd want to hire. We're not talking about making you hire him or anything like that, but so that you'd feel safe and better off, and who would or could be willing to do that. Then you move in and you can get advice on the practicality things that you have there. But on this one, the center comes later. People need to know that they're not going to be attacked by activists, and then the Chamber of Commerce can wander over. Is there somebody else with a mic?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, yes.
So the point you're making about the politics, I think, is real good. I think there's another part of the equation that we're starting to see, and that isn't that it's not just that people won't lose election over it, that people may win an election over it. And I think when you look at the state of Georgia where Nathan Deal ran, and he has been very personally involved in reducing the number of African Americans in prison by 20%, and I think the data will show that he had an increase in the African American vote. So I think maybe we can push beyond just the negative and start thinking about the positives. So some reaction to that?
Well, that will speed the whole process up. As long as I've been in it, the big questions you got were not, hey, can I make sure my name's on this bill? The people go, could we have other people's names on this bill? Again, the people who did this before, are they all still with us? But I think you're right. We now have a track record. And again, the track record is not just fewer crimes, fewer victims, less damaged lives, and so-and-so got reelected. I think Deal's doing better as a result of the Deal, Georgia governor, if he'd quit raising taxes. No, it's just a little one, but still. That if you say, look, this helps, okay? In Nebraska, of all places, with Ricketts, incoming Governor Ricketts, can say, yeah, they attacked me for this, but here I am, That's the next step. That's from covering yourself from being attacked and moving forward to where people will want to be out there. And there are some of us are talking, there are guys in the Senate calling around trying to move forward on this legislation aggressively forward as opposed to just step by step moving forward. That is the next step, and we are, I think, approaching that time where politicians will say, hey, I saw this work, and I want to get the credit for the next step in my state. And it's going to be, look, it's going to take longer than we want because the guys on the relevant committees are on the relevant committees because they've been around for a long time doing the same thing all the same way, and everybody they know has been doing the same thing the same way, and to turn around and say, well, that was pretty stupid, the last 20 years of our lives was a mistake, is not something that people do easily, okay? The best you can get is, we're not willing to say it was a mistake, but we won't do it anymore. And that's a huge step forward. And I think it's wise not to demonize some of the people who've done a lot of damage and just say, in the future there's this new way of looking at things and a new approach to it. You don't need to spend a lot of time beating people up for things that have not been as helpful as we want in the past, because then you spend time looking and fighting backwards instead of moving forwards. And if you don't make people feel bad about who and what they've done and what they've been, it's easier to get them to help you move forward. And that's always the good compromise. Nobody made a mistake, but we're not doing it again. Next. Okay. Microphone?
Right here, I guess.
Yes.
First of all, thank you. That was an awesome speech. I'm totally inspired. And I think what's inspiring is you're connecting a vision of justice with also a vision of what government can do. And I wonder if you have a way of thinking about, I think one of the problems that led us to having the largest prison system in the world is that we think we can have a perfect system, right? That with prison, we have a perfect answer to crime. And the reality is an effective system is not a perfect system. And that on some level, we will always have crime. We'll always have tragic events. And we should respond to it effectively. We should use prison, but we can't expect prison to provide a perfect response. And I wonder if you have an argument or a way of thinking about that.
That's interesting because politicians often go hyperbolic. We're going to eliminate nuclear weapons. Really? how about not having it go off? And instead of going with what you can, let's reduce crime. Okay, if you talk about eliminating crime, it loses some of its credibility, or you end up with rather draconian approaches in order to never have crime. And in a free society, people are always going to be making mistakes, and bad people do bad stuff. And how are you flexible in your responses? I mean, I look at, when you turn, how do we get crime down? I look at the last 30 years, and I can show you the data that says that sooner you got a shall issue concealed carry law in your state, the less you charge for it, the longer it lasts, and the more flexible your use of it is, the faster murders, rapes, and assaults have gone down in your state compared to everybody else. Now, that's not the criminal justice system, but it sure tracks with and precedes the drop in crime state by state, county by county, so you can compare what does and doesn't work. And I think that we just have to look at county by county data, state by state data, and have the 50 state, I mean, federalism, the guy who said states' rights screwed, states don't have rights, people have rights, okay? States have powers, states wield power, people have rights. Federalism is what we want. We want 50 states to compete to provide the best government at the lowest cost, where people want to live in those states. And combating crime is part of that. And so when states compete with, we have reduced crime more than other people, and we have less crime than other people, and cities do the same thing, they will get more people moving to those states. There's a great website I commend everybody, How Money Walks. HowMoneyWalks.com. That tracks internal migration in the United States. Not guys coming into the United States, but moving from California, to Texas and Nevada and Florida and New York down as well. And people move, and you can track it largely based on how high the income tax is. But it'll be interesting to see whether you could also track it based on crime data. I'll bet you that there's a great deal of movement within states and across state lines and across city lines based on whether crime's getting better or worse. And again, you can't do this hyperbolic, we're going to end X, because you're probably not going to. And then you just get people frustrated, or you've got to do something so bizarre and draconian to do that it's counterproductive. We need to set up a virtuous competition measuring outputs, and then letting the laggard states and cities and counties, the late adapters, to play catch up. One more question, I'm told?
Yes.
Yes.
I love your speech. I think you've made us laugh at ourselves, but when we look at ourselves in the mirror, it's very sad. 5 years for treason, 35 years for child porn. I have a question. You're talking rehabilitation versus retribution, basically, in your discussion. And that is looking at how we have also separated people from employment in some of the things that we have done. How do you carry that conversation? Because if we're going to go down the whole idea of building the economy and saving money, we have to put people back to work. Yeah. But that's a big push in the direction that what you're talking about, which I think is great, but help me have that conversation.
Well, I think you make a list of things that people do to make it difficult for felons to re-enter society. Some of it starts with how expensive it is to make a phone call out of prison to keep in touch with families. How close can they be to families? How easy is it to remain tied to the community, to children, to spouses, while they're in jail and in prison, so that you're not that far away and then you're coming back now. And then once you're out, now what? Okay, how can we work together? Fellow who runs Starbucks, Howard Schultz, has just announced he's going to get 10,000 veterans hired over the next 10 years as part of their hiring. We need to figure out how to make it possible to do the same thing for people readjusting, coming back out of prison in a way that helps. It's a little easier to go, hey, we hired veterans, come visit us, versus the guy behind the counter may have shot somebody. so you'll be safe. But there's got to be a way to make that work. I don't know what fields that's in, what industries that's in, but there are some where it's not the sort of PR potential problem. But also, I think one of the reasons why guys, you watch all those TV shows and you hear the stories of all these guys getting off on loopholes and that shouldn't be getting off, and therefore, when somebody finally goes to prison, they go, and the TV comics make jokes about people being raped in prison. Right? That's considered funny, okay? I mean, Jay Leno guy, I don't mean guys at the Improv in dark caverns, I mean guys on TV. And partially because people think, well, we catch so few of them. The ones we catch, we should just really let them have it. Put them in jail forever. As if, there were 3 guys, 2 got away, so the third one's really going to pay. He's going to be there forever, and he's going to be treated badly. And when he gets out, we'll still spit on him. We got to move away from that to catching the guys who do it, punish the guys who do it, punish them adequately, and figure out how we have people. Yes, he was punished. He didn't get away with murder. He didn't get away with a crime. 2, and then what? And it's not just one thing. It's not just lock them up. It's how do you treat them when you put those nice. It's very difficult to rob a bank these days because of cameras and the plexiglass and stuff like that. Well, we don't have as much bank. We don't make it easy to rob banks, okay? It's harder to steal cars with some of the new technologies, okay? That's not a bad start, okay? Better locks. All of this stuff is good. Let's make it tough for people to do something wrong. I would argue concealed carry is part of that. It's tough. I mean, 1 out of 20 Americans has 1 out of 20 adults has a concealed carry permit. Mugging somebody in most states in this country is like playing Russian roulette. How long you want to play that game, okay? So there's less of it. There's just, when you have more people with concealed carry, there are fewer people mugging people, fewer rapes, fewer murders. That's one part of it. Then how do you treat them in prison? Do you give them skills? Do you make them work at real work, not at make-believe work, but something that you can do outside? With technology, I mean, I don't know that, instead of having everybody in India doing call centers, maybe we could do it out of prisons here with accents that that you recognize. So there are a number of things that technology allows somebody. They don't have to break rocks, okay? And they can do it safely inside. They're used too dangerous. I want them in a prison. You can run a call center out of prison, But there are things one could do with technology that would train you so that when you're out, you could have an employable skill, whether it's on a computer or something else. So we just need to think differently and more deeply, and it's not, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If all you have is prisons, everybody looks like he should be in prison, and which is an improvement over crucifixes and stuff like that. But still, we could probably move forward in terms of how we deal with crime. So. We're wrapping up. Thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed working on this a lot. One last thought. I started working maybe 20 years ago with a group of 10 or 12 people in DC who were trying to think through some of these questions. And instead of going to my senior year in high school, I went to go watch trials in Boston, which was much more fun than going to high school, because I thought I was going to go into that field. But at some point, I realized I was the only guy in this little working group who didn't have an immediate family member in prison or hadn't been in prison themselves. And the Christian right movement, the prison fellowship, has really helped energize conservatives in recognizing the importance of getting involved. Not that they've all been in prison, but they go visit prisons and come back with horror stories about how people are treated, and they just have a completely different. It's not the group I would have said 30 years ago. Those are the guys who will be, banging on the wall saying, "Let's fix this," but they are, and they've come back and talked to people and say, "Look, this really we can do this better. We can do this more humanely. You can punish people without torturing them," and that's been part of it. And I don't know that they get as much credit. Thanks.